Welcome. On behalf of Countryside Church and the Center for Faith Study, I want to cordially welcome you all this evening to hear Michael Piazza with the Center for Progressive Renewal. Those of you who may not be familiar with Michael, you're in for a real treat. I've been I heard about him for years. His name invoked with the most highly reverential tones, like you must get to know Michael Piazza. Thought, who is this guy, Michael Piazza? And finally got to meet him a couple years ago at a conference, and it was just absolutely, you always worry about those people you hear just invoked with such reverential tones, because usually you're disappointed. Yeah. Usually they're egomaniacs, or there's just no substance behind that. But Michael is the real deal. Oh. And this morning in worship, and through both services, people really got a taste of what that means from him. We're in for some really fine exposition of an important topic. Last year the city of Omaha failed to pass a simple amendment to the non-discrimination ordinance to extend that to protection for LGBT persons, and many of us thought that was just such a no-brainer. It was an easy thing, the simplest thing to pass, and it actually failed. And as we knew we wanted to bring Michael here to talk about anything, because he can talk about like 15 different things really well. But as we were thinking about it, we thought, well, there's that saying that Martin Luther King made famous, that justice delayed is justice denied, and that justice denied for anyone is justice denied for everyone. And that we really need to maybe really reflect on how justice for LGBT persons affects us all, whether we're gay or straight. And Michael certainly has experience in that realm. If you happen to have one of these in your pockets, if you wouldn't mind turning that to off or stun, that would be appreciated. And those of you who are joining us for the first time, I want to especially welcome you, and just note that afterwards we'll be serving some refreshments in the commons area, which is off to your left. Is that correct?
Or just in the foyer.
Oh, in the foyer, okay. And also, if you need a restroom, it's just out and to the left, and find the wall and go to the left, and you'll find them right away. So. I'd like to, at this point, bring up Cindy Kugler, who's the director for the Center for Faith Studies, which is the organization affiliated with Countryside that's brought Michael.
Perhaps as you arrived this evening, you noticed the tile work in the courtyard. It's artistic, and it carries a message with lettering that says, "All are welcome here." And that message, crafted in many colors, has become weathered and beaten through the past several years, but the power of those simple words remains. It was pointed out to me by an attendee at one of our lectures several years ago, a person who came from another church in another town close to ours, that this was a very positive message for one who approaches our church building, and not one that she would have found in her own church's courtyard. I am proud to serve the Center for Faith Studies in a denomination and local church that evolves and grows, to live out that courtyard message in its most simplistic meaning, as well as its more complicated and multifaceted context for how we live in our city and our community. Many people, clergy and laypersons alike, are working hard in Omaha, our region, and our state to model love and inclusion and advocate for an entire group of our citizens who are marginalized. The timing was perfect for hosting our guest speaker tonight, Reverend Michael Piazza, who has spent the entire weekend with us exploring these issues, and who shared amazing sermons with us this morning. Please help me welcome him again to our sanctuary. And also, many thanks to PFLAG for co-hosting our event this evening. They have a table in the foyer next to Reverend Piazza's books, which are brought to us by the Bookworm, and we appreciate all of those organizations as well. So thank you, PFLAG and Bookworm. Hopefully you've looked at your program already for a minute, and as you can read in there, Reverend Piazza currently serves as co-executive director of the Center for Progressive Renewal, an organization that supports the birth of new liberal or progressive congregations and the renewal and strengthening of existing progressive churches. I chose to emphasize these words, even though you're taking them home in written form. I want to read them. Quote, "The organization understands progressive Christianity as a faith that believes God's family includes all people. God's people are responsible for caring for the environment, the poor, the sick, and the vulnerable. That education, healthcare, and civil liberties are vital to abundant life, and therefore the desire of God for all people. And that truth is found more often in honest grappling with the questions than in absolute hierarchical pronouncement of the answers. The organization further believes that this is the type of faith for which millions of Americans hunger." Unquote. And that brings us here tonight. The Center for Faith Studies welcomes the truths that surface when people from all over our community and region do come together to learn together, to engage in critical thinking, and to grapple with those very questions that lie before us. We look forward to what Michael has to share with us tonight and to a time for questions and answers afterwards. Our ushers will find you with a microphone, and we do ask that everyone uses a microphone so that we can clearly hear your question. And after Q&A, if you would allow us just a minute to take Michael out so that he can be at the book signing table and greet you personally and sign books. Please help me welcome Reverend Michael Piazza.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you all for being here this evening. I was talking to my partner as I was driving here, and he said, "Who is coming out on a Sunday night?" It's like, well, I hope someone will. So I'm grateful for you being here. An interesting thing in my life is that for the last 25 years, well, actually, if I was still living in Dallas, I moved in March. If I was still living in Dallas, next month would be my 25th anniversary at the Cathedral of Hope. The Cathedral of Hope is the second or third largest United Church of Christ, the second or third largest church in the denomination. The sort of phenomenal thing about that is that it is in Dallas, Texas. Now, for most of my time there, it was known primarily as the world's largest lesbian and gay church, and that was sort of its reputation. After a while, that didn't really mean a lot, and so we tried to sort of shift that to be known as the largest liberal or progressive or inclusive church in the South. But, you know, those of you who have made a reputation, and I'll warn you young people about this, those of you that make a reputation, it is almost impossible to change it. And so we had done such a good job making our reputation that nothing we did could ever change it. But one of the strange things is that this is the first time I've been asked to talk about this topic in years. So I realized, you know, I should be able to talk about this like in my sleep, but I've been the last several years actually talking about the progressive side of it. So one of the things that I thought was interesting is that here is like one of the largest progressive churches in the world in Texas. Now, you may, if you don't think that's a miracle, you've never been to Texas, you know, and so I've been spending this is my new career, is going around saying, hey, if you can do that there, you can do it anywhere. And so that's what I've been talking about, is progressive church and how progressive Christianity really can be rebirthed. Because if you can be birthed in Dallas, it can be birthed anywhere. But I am happy to be here tonight, and I so much appreciate Cindy's invitation and being with Eric and the folks at Countryside, so thank you, and thank you for being here this evening. On April the 16th of 1963, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who it seems I've talked about all day today, wrote what is now known as a letter from Birmingham jail. That letter, that open letter that has been published and reread and studied, was actually written in response to an open letter that had been sent from white clergy in Birmingham, who had to some extent sort of criticized not what Dr. King was standing for or what his values were or what he was advocating, but criticized actually his methodology. Their letter was entitled "A Call for Unity." And so the letter from Birmingham jail is a response to that call for unity from white progressive clergy, mostly, though they were Christian and Jews, who signed it. And so Dr. King is responding to that. And it's a beautiful letter that should be required reading for everyone. But one of the things that's interesting is they call for patience as opposed to direct action. And And Dr. King says that he believed that waiting 340 years for equality had been patient enough. And that now was the time for action. And what was really interesting in this letter is that clearly his frustration is not with the white racists of Birmingham and the South, but his frustration was with progressive folks who were holding the right values and saying the right things, but doing almost nothing about them and paying no price to make change happen. And far from being chagrined at their embarrassment that he, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, not yet, but would be, was in jail in their fair city. Far from being embarrassed about being in jail, he was embarrassed for them because they weren't in jail with him. And it was in that letter that Dr. King wrote, of course, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And clearly you believe that because you are here tonight. You believe that injustice to any people is a threat to justice for all people. And so while I speak as an openly gay man, a person who has spent almost all of his adult life advocating for equality for LGBT people, I also come to you recognizing that our struggles are common. And one of the things that has frustrated me more about my community than anything else is my own community's failure to be advocates for other communities. The LGBT community should be participants in the marches for the rights of people who are in this country without documentation, for immigrants. The LGBT community ought to be in the struggle for equality for women. I have a friend in Dallas who has been a long-time civil rights activist, marched with Dr. King. In fact, he is missing a front tooth. And I always, until I got to know him well, I always thought, surely he can afford to replace his front tooth. But the truth of the matter is that his front tooth was knocked out by a Louisiana state trooper in one of the marches, and he has left it that way as a reminder to himself and to others of the price that is paid for civil liberties and for civil rights in this country. So this friend, African-American friend, would just call me up all the time when I was in Dallas and say, we're doing so-and-so, I need you to come and do it. Put on a collar and come help. And every now and then I'd have to say, now why are we doing this? And the last time we did this, I was the only white face in a sea of African Americans, and I really was like, I'm trying to understand this. Like, what am I supposed to talk about now? Why do I care about this? And so he's trying to explain it to me. And as it turns out, that I didn't know this, but in places like Dallas, and I suspect other places, when they have gun shows, the gun shows put up all of the billboards, or most of the billboards, in largely African-American communities because people can buy guns at gun shows without background checks. And so it is a very deliberate way to arm a community. And so we were protesting that. But I had no idea that was true. I'd never been to a gun show. I don't know that I've ever even seen a billboard for a gun show. But so here I am, this little white guy there talking about it. But when he explained it to me, I was outraged. And so I could just, and so that day when they did the news coverage, it was all me. And so it was just this bizarre thing of this white gay man up there railing about guns and gun shows. Now, if you think being gay in Texas can get you in trouble, try being anti-gun in Texas. I got more hate mail for that, something I didn't even know anything about until a few minutes before I stood up to speak. But I think that's the way it ought to be. We've got to learn to care passionately about justice for everyone. And so I honor you for being here this evening. I grew up in South Georgia, near Savannah. My parents still live there. And in fact, I own a home in Savannah Beach, is probably where I'll ultimately retire to. So I grew up in the Deep South and grew up in the church. When I was 8 years old, I took myself down to the local Methodist church. My parents didn't really go to church with a name like Piazza, as you might imagine. They were Italian, and so they were Catholic, and so, so they didn't go to church much. And so one day I saw a sign for Vacation Bible School, and so I got myself up and marched myself down to the little neighborhood Methodist church where they were having Vacation Bible School. And I fell in love with the church. And my mother said I never left. I hardly ever came home after that. And it was true. I just fell in love with the church. I was enamored by everything about it. And so, I was there from the time I was 8 years old, well, until today. So, I've never left church. And so it was just one of those things. It got in my blood, and I fell in love with God, and I fell in love with the church, and it was a part of my life. And so it just became one of those natural things that as I became a high school student, and people would say, what are you going to do? What are you going to college for? I thought about some stuff, but the only thing I could imagine was giving my life to was to the church. And so that is what I have done. So the only thing I wanted to be in high school, and even in most of college, and until I got to seminary actually, the only thing I wanted to be was a Methodist minister. Now, the Methodist Church now and then, of course, you being a gay man or a lesbian person disqualifies you from being a Methodist minister. You can sort of slip through under the wire in a few places in this country, but South Georgia would not be one of them. And I knew that, but I thought, okay, so, I can be celibate or sort of not deal with my sexuality. And I actually had an interesting reason for thinking that. There was a person who was a professor at Cantor School of Theology, where I went to seminary, who ultimately was elected bishop, Bishop William Cannon. Bill Cannon was an expert in Wesleyan theology. He was someone who had a photographic memory. He would read the scriptures, chapters of the Bible. He would pick up the Bible and read it with it held up against his chest. And would just read chapters of it from memory. He was just a remarkable person. He was also the heir to the Cannon Towel fortune, which is probably why he got elected bishop. Because the chapel at Cantor School of Theology is named Cannon Chapel. From that money. But Bill Cannon was also a confirmed bachelor. So one occasion when he was still a professor at Candler at Emory, he was actually the dean of Emory, of Candler, one of his friends came to him, a friend who later became a bishop of Mississippi, came to him and said, well, Bill, you'd have a much better chance getting elected bishop if you were married. And Cannon thought about it for a few minutes and he said, well, that could be arranged. But what would I do with her if I didn't get elected? Well, so I had as a role model a confirmed bachelor who managed to make it all the way to the episcopacy. So I thought, well, maybe I can do that too. And so I went to seminary and I pastored churches all the way. I worked my way through college and through seminary as a Methodist minister. The first church that I served was a circuit of 3 small Methodist churches. They were named Charge of the Year by the Methodist Conference. The next church I served was a single point charge in a small suburban town outside of Valdosta, Georgia. Now, you can't imagine Valdosta having a suburb. But that was how small that town was. But it grew, that church grew, and I don't know if it was my fault or it was because of the population increase, but that church was named Charge of the Year. And so when I got to seminary, I got the preaching award, and so all of this recognition had sort of come along as I worked my way through college and seminary pastoring churches. And then I came out. Now, I thought that maybe I could just be celibate and quiet, and perhaps I could have. But during my seminary career, I started working at a local Methodist church there in Atlanta, and then decided to continue on and get a doctorate and stay there. But it was a very lonely thing because it was an older congregation where there were no young people, period, let alone gay or lesbian people. And so I decided that I would make friends, and I volunteered at the Atlanta Gay Center there in Atlanta. This was in the late 70s, 79, 80. And there, I volunteered for the helpline. And I thought, I'm a pastor, I know how to counsel, I can answer the phone and counsel people, and so that's what I volunteered for. And I did get to make friends. In fact, I have several friends to this day who I met there at the helpline training. The the person who was doing the helpline training was a young man about my age and about my height, and we chatted afterwards. And after about 2 or 3 sessions, the first session was on October the 18th. I remember that exactly because it is the day that I met Bill, and in a few weeks he asked me out. Now, I'd never been asked out on a date by a man in my whole life. I was in seminary, and though I had dealt with my own sexuality, it was between me and Jesus, okay? And so I had never, it never crossed my mind that this could happen. And worse yet, okay, now I'm a redneck from South Georgia, all right, I'll just admit that. But worse yet, he wanted to go to the ballet. I mean, you talk about gay. I mean, how much gayer can you get? So I thought, okay, well, I'd never been to the ballet, so we went to the ballet, and it was actually kind of interesting, kind of. And then we go out to dinner afterwards, and he takes me to a French restaurant. Oh my God, I had never eaten French food in my life. I couldn't read the menu, I didn't know what it was, and when I got it, I still didn't know what it was, nor did I much care. So it was how we sort of got started. Well, now 31 years later, we're still together. But so I thought that I could be celibate and quiet. The problem was, I just fell in love. I mean, so crucify me, and the Methodist Church tried to, I might add. But it wasn't my fault. I didn't intend to. I mean, we went to the ballet and to a French restaurant, for God's sakes. What was the odds? What were the odds of a redneck from South Georgia falling in love with somebody who would take them to something like that? The next date, I picked where we went. So I fell in love, and so what was sort of a theory suddenly became a reality. Well, the Methodist Church is kind of okay with theory. You can kind of don't ask, don't tell, and but when it became a reality, well, so Bill started coming to church, and I was an associate pastor at this church, and so it was a dying church, and so on Sunday mornings I would help out with the service, do Christian education, and then I'd preach on Sunday evenings, and it was a throwaway service. We had it in a little bitty chapel that could seat 20 on a good day. And so, who cared? But suddenly, all of my friends and Bill's friends started coming. And so we outgrew the chapel and we moved into the sanctuary. And the day that I knew my job was over was the day we had more people at church on Sunday night than we had on Sunday morning. I knew my goose was cooked. It was all over. And suddenly, this church was attracting all of these people from the neighborhood, many of whom, maybe even most of whom, happened to be lesbian or gay, but lots of whom were just younger people, younger couples, who were wanting to be around the people they lived around. And suddenly the church was coming alive again, and they would have none of it. They were the wrong people, but they were my people. And so that is my story of how I ended up getting kicked out of the Methodist Church. They asked me to resign my credentials, and I said, no, take them from me. And because my churches had been awarded and had been recognized, and because I had been recognized in seminary, they just said, oh, never mind, just keep them. Just don't use them. And so I guess technically I'm still a United Methodist minister because they never did and I never gave them back. So, but I kind of wanted them to force them to say, okay, you said all of these things that I did was right and good. And now you know the truth about me. I mean, I was that person all along. But now you know the truth about me and you're going to kick me out. And so I wanted to force that as a public issue, but they weren't playing that game. And I was young and not really sure that was a good idea anyway. But it was a very painful time because all I'd ever wanted to be was a Methodist minister. And now that was gone. When I was ordained as the Methodist Church, you come down and you kneel. And the bishop comes along and lays hands on you and says, take thou authority to preach the word of God, and that whole ritual. So you're kneeling in alphabetical order. So the person who is kneeling here, and I'm kneeling there, his last name begins with an M, mine with P. The person kneeling here was a much older man. I was 21, 22 at the time. He must have been 65 or so, I think. His name was Moore. In fact, everyone called him Big Jim Moore. And so after we were ordained, we were chatting, waiting to have our pictures taken and stuff. And I said, so Jim, what motivated you to go into the ministry so late? And he said, well, the truth is, I've been in prison all this time and didn't have a chance. And I said, oh, really? So I did. I'd be stupid. I'm young, stupid. I asked naive questions. I said, oh, really? What were you in prison for? I murdered somebody. It's like, oh, all right. So, he said, oh, yeah, I was a hitman. You just want somebody dead. I killed them for you. And they said, well, they never quite caught me for killing people, but they convicted me for something else, and so I spent most of my life in prison. So the Methodist Church had just ordained a convicted murderer. They knew that. But if they had known I was a gay man, they'd have never laid hands on me. Now, what is that about? Well, I think it is about a lot of things, but it is the root of what is so much of our issue in terms of just getting equality for all people. I said, so Bill and I fell in love, and a year later we got married, and which is an interesting thing. I mean, this is like 1980. No gay people are getting married in 1980. But, I was a church person. I was a person of faith, and so that's what people of faith did. So we marched ourselves down and got married in a mostly LGBT congregation. But we had 2 city council people there. You might have heard of one of them, John Lewis, Congressman John Lewis, who marched with Martin Luther King. It's still a dear, dear friend. In fact, if you look at my Facebook page, there's a picture of me and John. He was the Grand Marshal of the Gay Pride Parade just a few weeks ago in Atlanta. A dear soul, a saint of God, someone arrested 40 times. He was the youngest lieutenant of Dr. King, and in fact was the person leading the procession across the bridge in Selma, Alabama. Was beaten so badly that he was in a coma for 2 months. This friend that I was talking about, who always was getting me in trouble in Dallas, he said about John Lewis, John came to the Cathedral of Hope, and we gave him the Hero of Hope Award. He said of John, he was the most articulate of us all. But there was a long time, a decade or so, when you couldn't understand a word he said after he was beaten so badly. John Lewis is a great, great hero who on the floor of the U.S. Congress advocated for the repeal of the Defense of Marriage Act because he said, I've been discriminated against too long and fought too hard to end discrimination not to recognize it when it's aimed at somebody else and not to stand against it. A saint of God. He was at my wedding. What was not at my wedding, though, were 1,100 civil rights. I say we got married, and we did. One of the things, the reasons that this issue has not gotten any further in this country than it has is that we, that is LGBT folks and their supporters, have allowed others to frame the issue for us. Let me explain what I mean by that. We got married that day. What we did not get was civil rights. We exchanged rings and vows. We took communion together. We had a reception filled with tacky gifts. It was the whole 9 yards. We went on a honeymoon together. We got married in every way. We have been married for soon will be 31 years. We have 2 children. We have paid taxes every single day of our lives. We have bought and sold houses. We have recycled our garbage. We have voted in every election. We have been a good citizen of the United States of America. We have not violated any laws, except speeding occasionally, I suppose. But you know what? We are not treated like full citizens of the United States of America. It isn't about marriage. I got married to a man 31 years ago. It is about discrimination. Churches in this country, all over this country, will marry LGBT people. There are several churches in Omaha that will marry same-gender people. The United Church of Christ marries same-gender people. The Unitarian Church marries same-gender people. The Metropolitan Community Church has married same-gender people since 1969. Marriages have been going on in this country. You cannot stop gay people from getting married. I am living proof that in Georgia, if they could stop it, they would have in Georgia, all right? But they couldn't because of freedom of religion. So they couldn't stop me from getting married. But what they could do is discriminate against me. 1,100 civil rights that heterosexual folks get that same-gender folks don't get. In December 12th, 1912, 99 years ago almost, Representative Seaborn Roddenberry, who I am ashamed to say was a state representative or a U.S. representative from the state of Georgia, tried to pass a constitution a constitutional amendment that said this, and I quote, this is 1912, remember, intermarriage between Negroes or other persons of color and Caucasians in the U.S. is forever prohibited. Now that's all the constitutional amendment said. It did not pass, despite the fact that polls say that 90% of white Americans supported it in 1912. By 1958, the percentage of support had risen to 96%. Now, in that year, Mildred Jeter and Richard Loving in the state of Virginia got married. Actually, they got married in Washington, D.C., but they lived in the state of Virginia. It was against the law in the state of Virginia for a person of color to marry a white person. So they were arrested, tried, and convicted. The judge who convicted them said, and I quote, "This law is just because Almighty God placed the races on different continents, which proves He did not intend them to mix." It would be several more years before the U.S. Supreme Court would strike down Loving versus Virginia and rule all of these states who have had these laws unconstitutional. But that was in our lifetime for many of us. It wasn't centuries ago. So there is some progress being made, but we take our own sweet time about it. Now, why is this important? Truth of the matter is, it's difficult to resist against this because, frankly, my own community doesn't do a very good job. I mean, and who can blame them? You know, marriage is not so hot for straight folks. So, you know, why would we want to get into this institution where half the time it ends up in divorce, where it actually is a property law? You know, in many churches still to this day, the pastor, the priest says, "Who gives this woman to be married to this man?" as if she is a piece of property to be given away. And all of the laws surrounding marriage continue to be filed under property law. So why should we want to own one another? The traditions of marriage are, well, not all they're cracked up to be. So we haven't been so good about advocating for getting into these institutions. But we need to. We need to be. And there are a number of reasons. Let me just cite a few of them. Hospital visitations. It is still very true in this country, though President Obama issued an executive order that hospitals which receive federal dollars cannot discriminate. Still, religious hospitals in this country, on a daily basis, I hear people talk about the fact that religious hospitals in this country do not allow same-gender partners to visit in the ICU when their partner is ill. Their brother, their sister, their mother, their father, they can visit. But the same-gender partner has no more rights than any other friend off the street. You can visit during visiting hours, but no other time. Now that's not true. That's less true now than it used to be. But I can tell you, as someone who has been to tens of thousands of hospitals over the years. I have often met partners weeping out in the waiting room with no clue what was going on with their partner in ICU. And time again, as a clergy person, I've been able to go in and find out and come back out and tell them. Whereas if they had been a husband or wife, they would have been in there standing by their bed. Hospital visitation is still an issue. Ultimate life decisions. Now, my partner's brother and sister-in-law, his parents have been deceased, but his brother and sister-in-law, well, they're good Christian folks, which means they're really homophobic. And in the South. So when his mother was dying, she and I have to say about her, she was a saint of God. We traveled together. She came to our house, and we had great times together. We taught her how to drink. I mean, she had a great time with her gay sons and loved me, and I adored her. Her other son, my partner's brother, not so much. So when she was ill, she was living with them in North Carolina, and so of course we would go and visit on a regular basis. So I would go and see them and her, and it was, of course, they were there. It was in her home. Always ticked me off a little bit. It was in her home, but they were there, living there, taking care of her. And so I would come and hardly get a greeting or spoken to. And if I got thirsty, I'd have to drive across the street to the Minute Market because they weren't going to give me a cup of cold water. They were good Christian folk. They went to church every single Sunday. Now, if Bill gets ill to this day in some places, those medical decisions to be made won't be made by me. They'll be made by his homophobic brother. Unless I happen to have in my pocket my medical power of attorney. Now, how many of you have a medical power of attorney in your pocket? In your pocket. I mean, some of us have it. And I've got it in triplicate and in 3 locations. And I have several friends who hold on to copies of it for me. But if we are together in an accident and I don't have it, I am not his next of kin. His brother in North Carolina will be called to make that ultimate decision. And if he were to die, especially in places like Texas, the disposition of his body, what would happen would not be my decision, though we have had conversations about it. We have written out our funeral plans and those sorts of things. But his brother would decide. Because in the state of Texas, and this is very true, I can give you a dozen examples, I'll just give you one. A young man whose partner was dying of HIV/AIDS, and we talked, and I was there present when he talked about what he wanted to have done, and the one thing he said, holding his partner's hand and looking up at me as pastor, he said, "Whatever you do, do not let them take me back to," and he named the small town in Oklahoma. I spent my entire life there being bullied and tortured and tormented, and my family kicked me out when I turned 18 because they thought I was a sissy. I hadn't even told them I was gay, but they didn't want me. Don't you dare take me back there. And I said, "Worry, we absolutely will not do that. What do you want?" And he said, "I want to be cremated and put in the church's memorial garden so that every time Larry goes to church, he can visit me." Great. So, and I said, "Have you written all this down?" "Absolutely, I have." So, it all written down, it was all notarized, all those sorts of things. So, when he died, his partner calls me and says, his parents are here and they want to take the body. And they want to take it back to Oklahoma to have a funeral. Can you do something? And I said, of course. I picked up the phone, I called a lawyer, who called a judge, and the judge says, "No, you can do nothing." And it was like, what, why? I was a witness. I know what he wanted. And this is what the judge said to me. In Texas, dead people have no rights. The rights are held by the living. And he has no relationship, legal relationship with you or this man he claims to be his partner. His relationship, legal relationship, is with his parents, and they can do what they wish. They took the body back and buried in that small town of Oklahoma. Then they came back the next day and took everything out of the apartment that they owned together because the lease on the apartment was in the other guy's name. And so the entire contents of the apartment was their possession, and they took it away. So this is not a theory. This is something I've seen happen with my own eyes. And this is not something that happened in 1912. This is something that happened in probably 2006 and still happens in parts of the country today. Social Security. We all pay Social Security, but if your spouse dies and pays Social, you get part of their Social Security. Not if you're gay. We get absolutely nothing. The government keeps all of our Social Security, one or the other. Pension. My partner has worked in the same job for 20-something years, but it's been for 4 different companies. You know, he worked for American, he's a computer pro, he's a systems analyst. He worked for American Airlines, and they spun off Sabre, and EDS bought Sabre, and now Hewlett-Packard owns EDS. And so he's worked for 4 different companies in the same exact job. So he has 4 different pensions. I hope he outlives me, because if he dies, all 4 of those pensions, the companies keep. I get nothing, because we're not legally married. And so the companies keep it all. If we were legally married, the spouse, the widow, would of course get them. Immigration. When I was at the Cathedral of Hope, hardly a week went by when someone didn't call me because their partner, their spouse, was being deported. Now, if they'd been heterosexual, we would be married legally, and that wouldn't happen. But they were not legally married in Texas, and so off they went. Not just people who were immigrants from Mexico. The last one that I worked on was someone who was here from Italy, but his visa had expired. Estate taxes. If 2 gay men, 2 lesbians live together and manage to work hard and accumulate a good bit, and one of them dies, the survivor has to pay taxes on their own estate. The 2 of them have worked together to accumulate all this, but at least half of it they will have to pay taxes on, unless you can figure out in advance which of you is dying first. And then you can move it all to the other person. But that's a little risky business, I think. Family leave. If my partner's company has a great family leave policy, the problem is he doesn't get to benefit from it if I get sick. One of my dearest friends in life is a man named Hector Casas. Hector's a little guy. His family immigrated from Mexico, but he is a U.S. citizen, as his parents are, who are now deceased. Hector was one of the first people that I knew in Dallas in 1988 whose partner was dying of AIDS. Hector was one of the CFOs of Mobil Oil. And so Hector had lots of vacation and lots of leave and was able to care for his partner. But had his partner lived much longer, he would not have been able to. And so Hector, this first generation Mexican American, was on a retreat with the executives of Mobil Oil. And as they talked about things like benefits, Hector, this quiet accountant, came out to all of them and told them about his partner and how close he came to having to choose between his job and the love of his life, because he had no rights. There was no family leave in Mobil Oil for LGBT people. The CEO of the company, president and CEO of the company, whose name I wish I could recall right this moment, but I can't, wept at Hector's courage and witness. And on the spot, those executives changed the policy of Mobil Oil. Hector received a Hero of Hope Award from the Cathedral of Hope too, because he impacted, by his courage coming out, he impacted thousands of employees in Mobil Oil, until Exxon bought Mobil Oil. And they immediately reversed that policy, and to this day refuse. They are the largest company in the world without a non-discrimination policy. And though we picket them, their headquarters is in Dallas, though we picket them year after year after year after year, still, LGBT employees in Exxon have no protection. Courage like that deserves to be remembered, and I appreciate you letting me remember Hector in your presence this evening. Nursing homes. None of us think we'll ever get there. But if you're a heterosexual couple, you can live together in a nursing home. If you're a same-gender couple, you have no rights to do that. They might permit it, but that's up to the nursing home. Home protection. Bill and I have owned, probably 6 or 7 homes in our lives together. We bought them, fixed them up, and sold them, and along the way we've moved several times, him following me around from church to church. But in Texas, this is not true in Georgia, but in Texas, if one of us were to die, though we owned the home together, paid for, free and clear, the survivor would have had to go to court and in probate court win their own home back. Or they would have to buy it back, one or the other. On and on and on this could go. You know, back in the, 70s, there was this great poster that you saw sometimes. I saw it first in a feminist bookstore in Atlanta when I was in seminary. The poster said, "Ordain women or stop baptizing them." I thought that was great. Well, I want a new poster that says, "Marry gay people or stop taxing them." I pay the same taxes you do. I pay the same property taxes you do. Why should I have to go to court to fight to get my house back? It isn't, I don't really care how you feel about marriage or about LGBT folks getting married. I actually don't care about that. You can have your opinion and I have mine. If you don't want gay people being married, then don't marry one. It's as simple as that. You know, or don't go to a church that marries gay people. So there you go. You have every right to your opinion. What we do not have the right to do is treat one set of law-abiding taxpayers one way and another set of law-abiding taxpayers another. It is called discrimination. And no offense, but I'm kind of over heterosexual people having special rights in this country. Because that's exactly right what it is. Now, the religious right will frame it that we, the LGBT community, are seeking special rights. That is not true. Equal rights are not special. And that's all anybody wants and I think deserves. Well, Bill and I got married. That's what I've been talking about all this time, you know. And then in 1987, we moved to Dallas, Texas. Well, Dallas is and was a very conservative city, but in 1987, oh my God, was it conservative. I mean, it was J.R. Ewing was still, like mayor or something, I am sure. I don't know. But it was, if you remember that TV show, Dallas, it was Dallas. It is that city that you heard about. It really, really is. It was a true story. It was not anything fabricated. And so that was the city that I moved to. And so I come to this church, this little church that is dying. I mean, just dying. It's a time of deep recession. The savings and loan crisis had happened, so the economy had collapsed. The real estate market had collapsed. The church was in deep debt. They were losing, and literally people were dying. It was the worst of the AIDS crisis. Now, during my time at the Cathedral of Hope, I buried more people to HIV/AIDS, been infected with that disease in the state of Nebraska. We did over 1,500 funerals. Now, you can't even imagine going to a church where, every single member of the board of directors, every single male member of my choir but one, every single person on the pulpit search committee but the women, they all died within 2 years of me arriving. This is a church with 180 folks. I did 18 funerals one month, 4 in one day. There was never a church anywhere outside of a war zone that saw that kind of decimation. So that is the church to which I went. Every school teacher in the choir could have been fired because it was illegal to be lesbian or gay and teach public school. You couldn't be an out lesbian or gay person and be a firefighter. You couldn't be an out lesbian or gay person and be a police officer. So this is the situation to which I came. That church says, so the first thing you do as a pastor is say, so what is your vision? I mean, our vision is just to make it till next Sunday was kind of what I expected them to say. But they didn't. They said, our vision is to change the way lesbian and gay people think about God. They think God is the enemy, and we know that's not true. And to change the way straight folks think about lesbian and gay folks. Because remember, this is 1980, so the only, it was before Will and Grace or any of the kind of public images of gay and lesbian folks. And so they wanted to do that. And I said, you really want to do this? So, yep, that's what we're going to do. And so I said, all right. So that's what we set out to do. And that meant me sort of dragging them, kicking and screaming out of the closet, because that was the only way to do that. And so they became a very public church, despite the fact that we were on television every Sunday, despite the fact that every single school teacher in my choir could have been fired without any questions being asked. We began to fight the battle for civil rights and for equality in Dallas. Well, to make a long story short, though you couldn't be an openly gay or lesbian police officer in Dallas in 1987, today the sheriff of Dallas County is an out lesbian. She's been elected twice and is a member of that church. It tickled me to death that George W. Bush came home to a county where the sheriff was a lesbian. I just thought there was just something special about that. I don't know how he feels about it. It just made me happy. The chair of the county commissioners is an out gay man, just the past chair of the county commissioners, his term is over, is an out gay man and a member of that church. You couldn't be a school teacher, but 3 members of the school board are out gay or lesbian people and members of that church. No one runs for election in the city of Dallas without coming to that church to pay homage. It is a megachurch that spends $1.3 million a year on the poor and those in need, on public schools, on a health clinic for the homeless. Straight folks and even homophobic straight folks in Dallas will say to you, I don't believe in homosexuality. I believe it's a sin. But I wish my church was more like that church. You see, I debated straight folks and preachers all those times, and finally I just said, no more. I'm not arguing this anymore. You have your Bible. I have my Bible. You have your beliefs. I have my beliefs. You're not going to change my mind. I'm not going to change yours. It's a waste of time. And so we commissioned a sculpture of Mother Teresa. And on the bust of Mother Teresa, we put this quote. She said, too many words. Just let them see what we do. And so that church rolled up its sleeve, and they decided that if they would just out-Christian them. They would just, by God, be more Christian than the rest of the churches in the city. And so that's been their strategy, to convert people by being Christian. And their sort of philosophy, their philosophy about this is, at one point we had 28 full-time therapists, 28 therapists, not full-time, 28 therapists in our counseling center at the church. I was like, okay, I cannot hire enough therapists to cure you people, so I finally said, okay, enough of this. I got to figure out a better way. And so what we did was we decided that if you want to be, if you want to feel good about yourself, I know this was a revelation to me, you probably knew this all along, but if you want to feel good about yourself, be a good person. All the therapy in the world isn't going to help you feel good about yourself if you are not a good person. You deserve to feel bad about yourself if you are a bad person. If you are selfish, if you are racist, if you are mean, you deserve to feel bad about yourself. I don't want to fix you. So I adopted this philosophy. And so what we did was we just sent, this is a church dying of AIDS. And so I thought, I got there and all these people were dying, and I thought, oh my gosh, what do I do? And so the very first thing I thought was, I'll start an AIDS ministry. Well, I realized that I needed to do that, but that was the formula for disaster. So we did start an AIDS ministry. But you know what I did? I did everything I could to get these folks busy and serving people in the community. We lived in a very racially diverse community, and the church was fairly racially diverse, though mostly white. And so folks would come to the church and ask for food, probably like here. And so what we did was we put it in a grocery bag and we gave them food. And so one day I was talking to one of the people who came and got food, and she was talking about her kids, and she said, you know, my kids get breakfast and lunch at school, but on the weekends when I have to work, there's no one there to feed them. And I thought, oh my goodness, we should do that. So we started this breakfast program on Sunday morning first. And so we just invite, and we would tell these folks that, you know, if your kids, send them to here, down here, and we'll feed them breakfast at 9 o'clock on Sunday mornings. And so I thought, oh, 5 kids will show up. Pretty soon we were feeding 130 kids. 130, actually mostly almost all African-American children. And so, you know, we thought, well, we should do more than feed them. So we thought, well, we don't want to do Sunday school because their parents might or might not, you know, like agree with us. So we decided we would start a children's choir. So pretty soon we have this renowned African-American children's choir. I mean, it is the largest African-American children's choir in the city, being led by a lesbian. It was the most amazing thing. And then someone said, well, you know, we really probably should have a permit to feed these kids every week. And it's like, oh my gosh, you know, I've probably broken all these laws, but I've always been one of those people to ask forgiveness rather than permission. But what happened was these guys who were dying of AIDS, they would get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and come down to the church to prepare breakfast for these kids. And suddenly they were living again. They were alive. And the church came alive. And suddenly people began to come back to the church because it was the place that was offering hope. And when all of the leadership in the city, the LGBT leadership in the city had all died away, the church stood up and marched. When people were waiting 18 hours at the public hospital to get treated for HIV/AIDS, we were the ones out there picketing until they fixed that. Again, time and time and time again, we found our prophetic voice. And people came from everywhere. And suddenly, a church that is dying, that is burying people at an incredible rate, a church that is oppressed and discriminated against, is exploding in growth. Not because we were teaching folks about homosexuality and Christianity, but because we were claiming our prophetic voice, our place. We stopped asking permission to be who we were. And it is a remarkable thing to watch that miracle. I thought tonight we would talk about some of the scriptures that we reclaimed in that church. There's a book that I wrote a chapter in it called Take Back the Word. And I do think folks need to do that. I don't recommend the book nor my chapter. But I do think that LGBT folks need to take back the word. And there are lots of scriptures in the Bible that I think are our scriptures. There's the obvious Ruth and Naomi, and treat me not to leave you or return from following after you. There's Jonathan and David. There are lots of them. But I want to close with this one. It's one of the passages in the Bible, one of the chapters in the Bible that everybody knows, the 15th chapter of the book of Luke. You all know it. The story of the prodigal son is found there. There's another story about the lost sheep. But my favorite story in that chapter is the one about the woman looking for the lost coin. I love it for 2 reasons. One, that in that story, God is the woman. The woman is God. It is God looking for the lost coin. I love that God is portrayed as a woman, because so much of homophobia is rooted in sexism. That idea that the feminine is inferior to the masculine, that God is a he, and therefore he is God. And so by recognizing that the Bible talks about God in feminine terms, the Spirit is always described in either neuter or feminine terms. But in this story, God is a woman. And I think that homophobia can only be cured in our society by curing sexism. That it is rooted in those one and the same things. But the other thing I love about this story is that the woman tears the house apart looking for the 1 in 10 that was lost. And every lesbian and gay person in the world understands what it's like to be the 1 in 10, lost from God. And that story tells us of God's willingness to turn the world upside down to welcome us home. That's our story too. And I've been grateful to be able to tell thousands of people that fact. And it has made my life worth living. And I thank you for letting me tell you that tonight. So thank you. Thank you. Time for Q&A. Oh, thank you. Bless you. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you. I'm so glad to be here. God bless you. So we have a little time to ask questions, and I'll try to be brief. And one right back here.
I just have a question. When you were referring to the one incident with that person who didn't want to be shipped back to Oklahoma, you mentioned that even though he mentioned to you that he wanted this done, he did not want to go back and such. Wasn't there? What about? Didn't he have a living will or a will for himself?
He did.
And that was not on void?
The problem with wills is they are not legally enforced until they are probated. And so, that just takes months to do that. And so funeral homes always just do what the next of kin tells them to do, particularly in Texas. Because until the will is probated, it is not a legally enforceable document. So, now, living wills are slightly different things. And again, the durable power of attorney and medical power of attorney, those are all really important things. But they are important that you have them. And if you don't have them, no hospital is required to adhere to it. And so they oftentimes take the safer route, which is to follow the legal next of kin. So that's the danger in that. So, other questions? Or it doesn't have to be about stuff I talked about. I can talk about anything.
I just want to clarify for that because I think it's important information. The medical power of attorney and the living will die with the person, so then they're no longer in effect. And in Nebraska, you can't file to probate until 5 days after the death.
Huh.
And that's what leaves that gap of the funeral so vulnerable because it happens within those 5 days.
Yeah.
So just to
Thank
clarify
you,
for
yeah.
Nebraska.
Thanks. Law is not one of my specialties, so thank you.
I'm just wondering. Oh,
Do-
sorry, am I talking
So-
over something?
sorry.
I'm just, excuse me, wondering what you might be seeing out there that may make you feel hopeful.
I do think the world is changing a lot and changing rapidly, particularly around this issue. The most hopeful thing that I think is my daughters. Like, none of their friends. It's just not an issue for them. That is to say that no young person is homophobic, but not in the same way or for the same reasons. It's just not a non-issue. Now, mainline churches really need to listen to this, or churches really need to listen to this, because people like our daughters, they're not going to a church where their lesbian or gay friends are not welcome. And so that's going to cut both ways. But the good thing about progressive churches is that we are on, you quoted somewhere, it's in our conversation, that Dr. King said the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And that is right. And so we are on the right side of this issue, I think. And so that is, I'm very hopeful. It has changed so much in my lifetime, that I just can't imagine that it won't continue. I still have, that's just equally hopeful for racism to end in this country. It hasn't, but it will. Homophobia hasn't gone away, but it will. And so I think we're moving in the right directions.
Have you ever thought about getting married in another state?
Yeah.
Wherever you move to, you're married.
Yeah, the problem is that, so you get married in New York or Massachusetts or something, it doesn't count in Georgia. They don't, it gains you nothing in Georgia or Texas or Nebraska for that matter. It is only effective in that state. So it's a ceremony, and it's a legal ceremony in that state, but it doesn't gain me any more than the ceremony that I had in Georgia 30 years ago. So, and so we've spent hundreds, probably thousands of dollars to draw up legal documents to try to protect ourselves that we wouldn't have to do. The other thing so I'm not afraid of this anymore because my daughters are grown, but you know, our whole life with them growing up, I was their legal parent. Bill had no legal standing. So if I were killed in a traffic accident, the state would have taken them away and put them in a foster home, though he had reared them their whole life long. Well, one is my biological daughter. We had a surrogate mother, and the other is adopted. We adopted her when she was 3 months old. But in Texas, only one person can be, unless you're married, only one person is on the birth certificate. So he was not on the birth certificate.
But don't you name a guardian? Like I had guardians for my children who were siblings of mine.
But it is entirely up to the state at that point. It's your wish, but you're gone. Dead people have no rights. So you can express your wish, but it doesn't necessarily mean that'll be. And especially with gay and lesbian folks, it entirely was up to a judge. And I can't tell you how many hundreds of times in the late 80s, early 90s that I saw children taken away from a lesbian or a gay parent. Or how many times I saw couples get divorced and one of them come out and not be allowed to see. I have a friend who's a professor at Texas Christian University, and for 5 years he was not allowed to see his triplet daughters. They were 10, 12 years old by the time he was able to see them again after he divorced his wife, just purely because he came out. And so that's still going on.
Hello. This is more of a legal question. You say there has been some progress made in recent years regarding same-sex marriages. Namely, the state of Iowa, I do believe, by news, recently passed a law stating, it's legal for same-sex couples to be married. Having said that, does that mean that now those couples are recognized under law and have rights as if they were a traditional marriage, as in life insurance, real estate property, next of kin rights, etc.? Has there been progress made in that area for those states that have legalized same-sex marriage?
Yes and no. In the state of Iowa, all of the state's civil rights are imparted to them, but none of the federal ones. So Social Security, immigration, those are the ones I can think off the top of my head, but those don't apply. And if they moved across the river to Nebraska, none of them would apply. And so it is becoming increasingly convoluted. And the other thing that's really dangerous is that in this next election, Iowa is very close to a tipping point of going backwards on it. And so there's a great deal of fear that this next election, we've identified a couple of state representatives who are running for re-election, who, if they're replaced by a more conservative representative, could tip the balance and could put it on the ballot to be voted on in the state of Iowa. And no minority in this country ever won their civil rights by public ballot. Pilate put it to a vote, and they crucified Jesus. So while I appreciate democracy, our government is designed in such a way to protect the minority against majority oppression. And that's exactly what could happen in Iowa. Somebody else? Anybody else? One of the things, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just wondering how old you were when you came out to your parents.
Younger than I intended to be. I had not intended to come out that particular time. Bill and I had just gotten together, and I had left the Methodist church, but was pastoring a little, mostly LGBT church there in Atlanta. And that was all well and good, and I was still getting used to it all myself, figuring it all out myself. So I wasn't quite ready to come out to them. But the problem is that somebody firebombed that church. So my name, of course, was on and so the fire department calls me to come and close it up. And so this is Sunday morning, the building is burning. I get there, and there's all the media. This is actually Friday night, Saturday morning. There's all the media. So there I am, a full-color picture, top fold, of the Sunday edition of the Atlanta Journal and Constitution. Everybody in Georgia reads the Atlanta Journal and Constitution, or did. And so there I am on my parents' doorstep. So that's how they found out. It wasn't what I'd planned.
I would think not. And were they accepting? of you?
No.
No.
Not at first. It took about 4 years for them to get used to the idea, but it took me about 24 years to get used to the idea. So, I kind of understood it was just going to take a while. And the problem is they not only had to get used to, I'd been their pastor. Literally, I'd come back and was the pastor of their church. So they had to deal with it, and they had to deal with everybody in their community, small community in South Georgia, dealing with it. And then they had to deal with having a son-in-law they kind of never expected to have. And so it really was sort of that issue that sort of forced it. And finally, one Christmas I said, I'm not coming home without Bill. It was one, he went to his family and I went to mine because it just was convenient. But then one year we couldn't do that. We owned a business together. And I said, I'm not coming home without Bill. So they said, okay, we'll bring him home. And it's been perfect since then. They love him more than any of their other in-laws, I think. So it has really been good. He and my mother get along great, so that's all wonderful. Me and my father never got along, so it didn't really matter. So that's not really quite. But he's kind of this butch macho guy, and so he's going to go fix the car, and it's like, okay, I can't help you there, and neither can Bill. So we'll stay in the kitchen with Mama. Yeah.
Church for a while, but one of my big issues is that people don't spend money helping people. I feel like a lot of money gets spent on, infighting and political nonsense and things like that. How do you handle that in your church, I guess, to make that more of a reality, to make that more of a day-to-day instead of, talking about yourselves and what you wish you were doing and actually just going out and doing it? Why is it so hard?
Well, we talked about that in Darkwood Brew tonight, that Amos, the prophet, said, I just really have, God says through Amos the prophet, I don't really have a lot of use for these, your songs and your sacrifices and all this sort of stuff if you're not doing justice. It's that famous passage, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. But I blame it on Constantine. I think, the church was all well and good until Constantine became a Christian. When they were killing us, the church was good. When they were throwing us to the lions, the church was doing really good things. And I say that jokingly, but there is some extent to which it was true. Jesus, I think, founded a countercultural movement. And suddenly, when the empire sort of became baptized, we became the defenders of the status quo. And the division between the sort of prophetic church and the institutional church was blurred and too often, I think, gets forgotten. It isn't true about all churches. And unfortunately, this is what I was trying to say this morning. Unfortunately, there are more good churches than you know. And the reason is I think the other churches, I won't say the bad churches, but the other churches are the ones that are more visible, more articulate, more out there, more on television, more doing political stuff. And the really good churches often are just very sort of reticent to speak out on issues, and they're very welcoming, but they're not. This church is one of the best churches that I know of anywhere. But you just recently voted to be open and affirming, right? Just like in the last few months. And so this church has always welcomed LGBT folks, but it's only recently said, okay, we're going to do this public thing. And it was a great sort of step, but it's just because you're all good people. But that's not enough.
Kind of a follow-up to that, like you were saying, there are more good people, more good churches than you know, and I get the Pat Robinson argument and everything.
Yeah.
I know I've worked with Operation Blessing and stuff like that, and I've seen all of those videos they show you and help people and things like that.
Yeah.
But I don't know that I necessarily agree with that idea. I feel like even the good churches spend so much time spending money on branding and just trying to beat them at their own game. Like you're saying, go out, do what you're supposed to do.
Yeah.
Be Christian, beat them by being Christian, and don't try to beat them at their own game because it's a stupid game to be playing anyway.
Yeah. Well, that is right. But I would say, so I have a really good friend who's the pastor of the Metropolitan Community Church in Toronto. And so every year at Christmas Eve, they rent the huge symphony hall downtown. And they have this gigantic worship service. Literally thousands of people come. It is standing room only for 2 or 3 worship services that seat 2,000 people. It's just a huge thing. Well, the first year they did it, someone said, you could have used this money and fed the hungry. And my friend said, we did. Jesus said, humans don't live by bread alone. And so there is a spiritual hunger out there as well. So, and lots of good organizations feed the poor, and the church should be one of them doing that. But not lots of good organizations feed the soul. I mean, nourish people in other kinds of spiritual ways. And so it really is important that the church do that as well, and not just be a prophetic social organization. And I think there is a deep spiritual need in this country that if the churches could begin to fill it and to say, now this is what it means to love God. It means loving your neighbor as yourself. That's what religion is. That's what Jesus said was important. So I think it has to be both of those things. I wanted to say that, so while you're finding somebody else who wants to ask a question, I have a really good friend, I forgot to quote her, I almost always do, named Lynn Lavner. She's a Jewish comedian. She's retired now. She's old like me. She was a great singer. She would sing at the piano and sit at the piano and sing these songs and just make them up, and they would just be hysterical. I mean, like wet in your pants hysterical. And one of the things that Lynn Lavner, she was just playing along one time and she stopped in the middle. And she said, I read the Bible every now and then. And one of the things I realize is that in the Bible, there are like 6 verses that apply to homosexuality. And she plays and sings some more. But in the Bible, there are like 1,300 verses that apply to heterosexuals. And she plays a little more. And then she says, I don't think it is that God doesn't love heterosexuals. I just think they require more supervision.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here, first of all. I think
yes.
we need to duplicate you throughout Omaha especially, but
thank you.
in more and more places. So as the pastor alluded to in his introduction, last spring it was, the City Council of Omaha failed an anti-discrimination clause in the workplace for LGBT folks. And I believe it's probably going to come to the City Council again. Would you have any words of advice in our fight to those people?
The thing is, this is my sort of take on Omaha. I did a little research actually about the city, and just to confirm that my, not bias, but my instincts about Omaha were true. In the South, we would say that Omaha is a Midland city. It's a Midland size. It isn't too big. It isn't too small. It's in the Midland of the country. It's Midland in terms of its climate. It's not too cold like Chicago or Cleveland, but it's not too hot like Dallas or Houston. It's just kind of Midland. And I think it's just kind of Midland about issues like this. It's not that it's particularly a homophobic city. It's just kind of this white Midland town that, just is kind of don't ask, don't tell. And it's not really a problem here. And it's really not until it is. And then when it is, there's no protection. And that really is the point. I think that it is, 71%. I asked, I think you last night, about the racial makeup of Omaha. Well, she didn't know because she was new here. So I went home and looked it up. And Chris, by the way, Omaha is 71% white. It's 11% African American and 10% Hispanic, and the rest Asian and the rest. So it is an overwhelmingly white, middle-class city that voted a little bit for George W. Bush against John Kerry and a little bit for Obama in the last election. So it's just sort of that kind of thing. And that's the hardest thing of all. It was sort of what King was addressing in his letter from Birmingham jail, that it was easier to deal with the racist than it was with these sort of good progressive folks who just didn't want to stir things up too much. And so one of the things that I think has to happen, and I don't know how to do this, but I think people have to tell their stories. Now, you'll go out of here tonight and forget 90% of what I've said this evening, but the stories will make you remember something. You'll remember the stories. That's the way it always is in church. People forget all the text, but you remember the stories. And it is finding folks to tell their stories. Doesn't have to just be lesbian and gay folks, but it can be parents who come and say, I want my child, my grandchild, to feel like they can come and work in Omaha and be safe. Omaha really is one of the largest cities in America without a non-discrimination ordinance. I went to Dallas thinking, oh, this is a done deal. because in the 80s, mid-80s, Atlanta passed it. Now Atlanta in the mid-80s passed it. But you know why? Why? John Lewis then was a city council person, an African-American civil rights leader, stood up and insisted he wouldn't sit down until they passed this ordinance. And so it is finding somebody like that with some credibility and some cachet to stand up and refuse to sit down until they do the right thing. Because the problem is, it isn't an issue until it is an issue. And so, it's the same thing with all of these. I mean, the hate laws in Texas. I mean, I fought and fought and fought for that. And everybody said, well, what difference does it make? Murder is murder. And so what happened in Texas was the James Byrd dragging sort of spurred a desire in the state of Texas to pass a hate crimes law. Well, the James Byrd family, I got to know them fairly well. They were, the Jasper, Texas, was as redneck and backwoods as the small town South Georgia where I grew up. And this was not a sophisticated family at all. They were women and men whose subjects and verbs rarely agreed. But they decided that they were not going to endorse a hate crimes law in the state of Texas. They wanted to name it the James Byrd hate crimes bill. They would not endorse a hate crimes law in the state of Texas unless it included sexual orientation. And George W. Bush, governor then, called them into his office and said, we will pass this law in 24 hours if we can take sexual orientation out. He was planning on running for president. He didn't want anything passed that had sexual orientation in it. And they said no. They went out and called me. And I called a press conference. And George W. Bush went that night to a Texas Rangers game, and the media came up to him and asked him about it and quoted me by name, and he said, well, that damn Pastor Piazza ought to mind his own business. My greatest claim to fame is that George W. Bush cursed me by name. So I just had outed him. So we gave this family the Hero of Hope Award because they were heroic. And fortunately, when George went to Washington, sorry for you all, but we got it passed. And even Rick Perry said, okay, I'm not fighting this battle, it just passed with sexual orientation in it. And people ask, so why is this important? Murder is murder. It's important because it says something about who we are as a people, that these are our values. These are our standards. This is unacceptable behavior. Of course, murder is unacceptable behavior, but we do not want to foster in our state the kind of hatred that leads to racial murder or to homophobic murder or to any kind of murder for that matter. But it is saying something about our values. And I wouldn't have fought for that nearly so hard if it had never been in there. But to put it in there and take it out says this kind of hate is unacceptable, but that kind of hate is okay. And that we weren't giving up on that fight. And so it is the same thing. This ordinance, whether it will protect anybody's job or not, who knows? But it says that we as a city, we as a people value or don't value, have a value around non-discrimination. And I think that really is important. So just time for one more question. Okay. Well, I thank you all for being here. It's late, I realize, in the evening, and it's been a long day for you, as probably as well as for me. But I want to just say that you have been wonderful, and you have been great hosts, and I have been greatly blessed by being able to be here. And I just want to say that this is not something that I talk about anymore. But as I talked about it, I realized this is not something that I get to talk about anymore. And it still needs to be talked about. I love my other job, but I'm glad to have this opportunity to continue this struggle and this fight. And I am so deeply grateful to have allies like you and like this church in this fight. So thank you, and God bless you.